mainly in the southern part of the Atlantic, has been left overnight without financial means to cover their basic needs. The situation has been aggravated by the low levels of access to social protection. What is the role of the social state in fighting inequality? What are the main policies that governments should prioritize to help reduce inequalities within countries and ensure that economic gains are shared between all parts of the society?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our moderator for this session, Vice President of News and Civic Dialogue at WHYY News, Sarah Glover.
Good morning. It's so good to see you all, and it's my distinct honor to introduce our panel. First, we have João Vélez de Almeida, Ambassador of the European Union to the United Kingdom. Next, Carlos Leopes, Professor at Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, Faculty of Commerce at the University of Cape Town. Next, we have Sirné Gay Diop, Minister and Advisor to the President of the Republic of Senegal. And last, we have Maria Teresa Fernandez de la Vega, President of the Women for Africa Foundation. Welcome. Good morning. What an exciting time to be having this discussion on inequities in the social state and with this esteemed panel. We will start off with Ms. Fernandez de la Vega, who will give us some insights around this topic in inequities and how this is impacting women in particular. You may give us some insights.
Sí.
Yes, sí.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Policy Centre for their kind invitation to take part in these Atlantic dialogues, which are always so enriching and so vital. And particularly, my thanks for having given me the opportunity to be part of this panel on the inequalities and the responses from our societies. We should all be on the lookout for these issues, since so much is at stake. Really, so much, because this is one of the issues that have taken the most time along the course of my political life. I am therefore very happy to be part of this discussion. It is true that things change, and the question is no longer whether we can ignore it or put a stop to it, but rather whether we want to manage it, if we want to govern it, we, the citizens, on the basis of justice and equality basis, or whether we're going to leave it to the governments to manage it. And it is now the time to ask ourselves in an individual and critical manner where we're heading and how we want to make that road, because what we are witnessing is the rising of fascism, and instead of looking for the most needy, we are confronting them, and instead of ending wars, we are finding new wars, particularly at a time after the pandemic that has swept the world. And this has led to even more inequalities. Pierre-Louis Reder used to say that the great revolution that changed the world was done due to love for equality. And this is indeed the value that is the reason behind the construction of a system based on citizens and not on servicemen and women. And we see inequalities in our societies, and we cannot halt it And we see an increasing number of studies and papers on the issue, but they are not translated into actions. And unfortunately, the large international organizations have been alerting for quite some time about the progress of inequalities. The World Bank, the IMF, and even the Davos Forum have been publishing reports on the prejudices and the risks of this situation. However, these warnings may appear as very mild recommendations sometimes compared to the times where countries were forced into acting. But our largest issue is not the markets themselves. We don't oppose markets. I certainly do not oppose them. I think our problem is the values that have been mistreated, ignored altogether, and we are compromising our values because to us, the value of democracy is the most important value. It is absolutely paramount. And why is this? Well, it is because democracy requires politics, and this is the most important thing to remember. There is no democracy without politics, and democracy is now the issue that we have to work around, and the state is losing so much of its credibility due to capitalism. The state appears as something of other times, and we're talking such important issues as public health, the redistribution of wealth, equality, and real equal opportunities. We're talking about the state, and there is nothing as important as the state and the states that saved the economic powers themselves at the time, because that's what happened. The states actually did save the economic state after the Great Recession not so many years ago. And we're talking about democracy, we're talking about welfare, we're talking about rights, we're talking about these states where there is the rule of law. Because a state that does not promote equality and peace for everyone, equality among its citizens and fighting exclusion, cannot be a democratic state. As many elections as they may hold, we need not only to defend but also to revitalize the public space, the space for everyone, this necessary public space for collective living of the citizens, where education in capital letters, culture in capitals, and ethics are the wealth generators of intellectual, moral, and material wealth. And along that way, we, the women, are the leaders, aren't we? We have many women here in the room and also many men, but I want both women and men to know that we are at the forefront. And we need to think about things like international peace, financial stability, health, food security, preserving biodiversity are examples of global actions that affect everyone across the globe. That is the issue. That is one of the issues anyway. And we have concepts that were questioned or ignored and are now back, such as co-responsibility, cooperation. These are the issues, and this is what I believe we're going to be discussing this morning, and we will try to do our bit to make progress on some of these issues. Thank you.
And next we'll hear from Mr. Diop. And interesting to hear from your perspective on the social state and inequalities and your work in guidance for the President of the Republic of Senegal.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. We'd like, first of all, to congratulate our friends from OCP, Atlantic Dialogue. This is very, very important that Africa comes together and make their voice heard, and call here all over the world to start discussing on issues relating to the development of the world, but also development of Africa. So congratulations really to OCP. I see the inequality from my three hats. As I said, a minister in Senegal, advising the president on agronomic and agricultural policies, industrial policies, and anything related to science and technology. For those who do not know me, I was the president of Nestle Research in Africa. And the second is, as a mayor, I'm in charge of the local development. I'm mayor of a city called Sanjara, where OCP is also settling a big fertilizer factory as well, where we're starting developing income generation project for remote areas. And my third hat is also the president of the economic industrial zone, which is a solution to this inequality. But first of all, when we talk about inequality, we're talking about different types of inequalities. One is economic inequalities, financial inequalities. We talk about income as well, and we talk about political inequalities, justice-related justice inequalities, so, and even gender inequalities. This is very important. So it's not a very simple issue to solve and to. And faced to those inequalities, you have what we call social state, in French, état-providence, or état social. In Switzerland, they will talk about état social. And you have also the liberalism, who said, okay, inequalities are normal. I don't have, we are in a competition, so anybody with your own talent should just compete to be at the highest level. But today, this is not working, because we know that this brings justice, political issues that lead to conflict. We see it in Africa, and this is not acceptable. In the case of countries like Senegal and West Africa, the choice of our government is to be a social state inequalities, l'état-providence. We have to correct that. You cannot just say that people at 1,000 kilometers from the capital city, they have to deal with their own problems. It's not normal. Unfortunately, for the last 15 years, many projects have been attempted to correct this. It is about access to water. In some of the areas in Senegal, we have a big project we call the PUDC, which is successful. We had areas at 1,000 kilometers from Dakar, they don't have water, no road, no even health center. And these projects are very important to make sure that the citizen at the part of the country has the same access to hospital. We just built 3 new hospitals in this very remote area, Kédougou, for those who know Senegal. But it's not enough, because if you create roads, you create health center, you need to create now jobs. How do you create jobs? To create jobs, you need to make sure that you create now what we call economic industrial zone or agricultural industrial zone. You need to choose in those remote areas some farms, or public farms or private farms that the state must fund to make sure that people stay there. Because we know it from all over Africa, Abidjan, Dakar, Conakry, the problem is the same. People are going to leave the rural area to go to the cities. And this creates as a problem in the cities. Finally, they don't live very well in the cities, and they don't live very well in the rural area. So this was a project we call Zone Économie Spéciale and Agropole. The second was called Promoville. Promoville was also a project to correct as well these inequalities. What's happening is when you go to many African countries, you will see that in these cities, inside the country, there is just nothing. No roads, no electricity, no water. I'm talking here the medium, I'm not talking about the villages. Here I'm talking about even the medium cities. And in Senegal, we had this project we're calling Promoville, which actually focus on making just the basic infrastructure like roads, electricity, and so on, just to correct these type of inequalities. And the third one was access to education. We know that in Europe, I did my studies in France and then in US, and we see that the people, the more wealthy people, has more access to education, to university. This is very clear, because it's very expensive. But in these African countries like Senegal, we were facing the same problem. where people in Tambacounda, in Kédougou, in Matam, the universe is 1,000 kilometers from the cities. So we had to build what we call UVS, Université Virtuelle du Senegal. We saw it in Quito. I was in Latin America before. In Cuenca, there's one of the biggest virtual university with numeric access. And that's what we did in Senegal. We built 14 of those so that anybody can have access to the courses, the program of the university in Dakar. That's a way, a little bit, to have some practical solution for that. And the last example I wanted just to highlight, because we need now to correct, was a program we call PUMA. PUMA is actually a program that we're trying to correct the problem we have with the borders. Everybody knows that when you come to the border between Senegal and Gambia, between Mauritania and Senegal, generally those borders, there was no investment. It's a problem because it's very far from the city, and you start wondering, why should I invest there? Yeah. But if you don't do that, this population, actually, they are left. They have no access to education. They have no access to health. Because Gambia would say, okay, I'm not going to invest there. It's too close to Senegal, and Senegal would say the same. Finally, we had a program to correct also these border issues. We need to bring three things. First is education. That's the most important, because education and human resource capital, this is the most critical in Africa. It's not only the economy. Okay, so we build schools there all along the borders between Senegal and Gambia, all along the border between Senegal and Guinea and Mali. And this program, PUMA, is now building health centers as well, because education without this health center don't really foster the human capital. But it's not enough. We had now to start building these economic projects on agriculture, women support as well, youth support, very important project for all the young people, for the women, so that they have really the place in the city. So how do you measure now those? Because the one thing is to have a project, but the other, in science, we have to measure. And to measure this, you need to have this, what we call, and this is the Développement Humain, Human Development Index. We saw in this area that all these Human Development Index were very low. How many years people spent at school? Less than 2 years, as less than 3 in their whole life. You know, as was just how many doctors you have in 1,000 people of the population. So you have as economic index, a social index of development. And this is really the best way to know if these policies of solving inequalities are efficient. Because in science, when you don't measure, you don't really know where, if your project is key. And in this approach, you have two actions. One is government action program, and the other is local municipal action, like as for the mayors. And that's where I will maybe finish. In my case, I'm the mayor of the city we call Sanjara, which have 1 million square meter of industrial zone, and where we try now to create jobs in the cities, 100 kilometers from Dakar, where all type of companies will come now and solve this issue of income, of job for young people, of job for women, of really making sure that people don't go for immigration to Europe and stay in the villages. So this is really a solution that I experimented today, and I think we created more than 3,000 jobs just in the last seven years. OCP is already there, many Moroccan companies, French companies, American companies, all the companies are coming. And this is really the key. The solution must be economical as well. You cannot solve these inequalities if you don't have economical policies that will attract investment. Because if you want to create jobs, you must first have investment. And this investment will generate, of course, jobs. And then this generate growth. This is really the virtual cycle that we're trying to develop. So by now, that's what I wanted just to say in my own experience in Senegal as a minister, as a mayor, and as the president of the economic zone of Sanjara.
And thank you so much. And to that point around economics being at the centerpiece of solving for this issue, excited to hear from Mr. Lopez around governance, the impact that that can have on this issue and leveling inequality.
Thank you, Sarah. I think after listening to the two interventions, maybe I'll bring a different perspective from a dimension of the inequality debate. First, we have to admit that over the last few centuries, we had a trajectory of growth and development that has brought a lot of good things to many people. The progress has been immense, and we have reduced poverty in relative terms quite significantly in the world. And the fight for equality has gained dimensions that we could not have suspected possible a few decades ago. And we can be proud as universe for having a trajectory that has produced such results. However, we have also to admit that this trajectory has created two big problems. The first is the one that occupies a lot of minds these days, is that we have a consumption and production model that is incompatible with the climate requirements of the planet. So we emit too many greenhouse gas, and we cannot continue in this trajectory. We have attained a level of emergency. So it's a planetary emergency. And the second problem is that we have created an accumulation of wealth that is unprecedented. I was just mentioning the progress made, but at the same time, this progress has gone hand in hand with levels of wealth accumulation that are absolutely astonishing. We know from different advocacy proclamations that the 1% richest part of the world has the same wealth as half of the planet. And this is actually very much linked to the other problem, the climate change problem. We try to address them separately, but they are one and the same. We have systemic difficulties that do not allow for us to correct the trajectory. The way we deal with intellectual property, the way we deal with research and development, the way we deal with innovation is not geared towards sustainability. It's not geared to a certain type of public goods that are absolutely indispensable to deal with the planetary emergency. We deal with them with a logic that allows wealth accumulation. So we have a problem. We have to correct this trajectory. And if we don't do it very fast, we are going to face the consequences of climate change. Extreme weather phenomena is already there to tell us that this is not a joke. So the issue is whether we have the instruments, the institutions, and the will to actually change this trajectory. And I come to the very noble Sustainable Development Goals objectives. What do they tell us? In practical terms, about 300 years ago, or more than 300 years ago, Jean-Jacques Rousseau published his social contract. And basically, the idea there was to translate intergenerational solidarity from the realm of a family to the realm of a nation and a community. And for that, he understood that it was absolutely indispensable to have a certain number of institutional tools that would allow for this intergenerational solidarity to be regulated, to be organized, to be structured. What we have witnessed since is an evolution of this concept all the way to what we call today sustainable development. It's basically the same thing. We are preserving the planet for what? For the future generations. Therefore, we are talking about the same philosophical principle. which is we need to preserve things for the future, and the future is the next generation. Therefore, what you would expect that parents want their kids to have a better life than they had is just translated into a global dimension. The problem with such a noble objective is that we basically have to admit, with the demographic trends that the world knows today, when we talk about the next generation, and we know that from the year 2034, more or less, 1 in every 2 newborns will be African. We're basically talking about the next generation that often is regionally, geographically, far from those who have the wealth. And you are basically telling aging populations in the richer countries where there is the largest accumulation of wealth to exercise a solidarity for the next generation when, in practical terms, what they see is not that they are protecting their children because they have less and less of them, but rather that we are basically being concerned about the invasion demographically of all those people being born elsewhere that can come to our borders. So this is running against the idea of intergenerational solidarity. And that is one of the reasons why the debate about wealth accumulation is entangled with this difficulty. So we have these global dimensions of the problem that paralyze the will. And paralyze the will in terms of reforming institutions, reforming instruments, tools, because even though from an analytical point of view, the most intelligence that we can gather to actually create the strategies and the opportunities for transformation are available, are known, and intelligent people are much aware of it. They have a bit of a political difficulty selling this because it's not easy. And that generates populism in certain countries. That generates polarization in most countries. And that creates this impression that we are going to solve the problems just with technical solutions. But in fact, we are dealing with philosophical principles and very deep-rooted fears and concerns that are basically justifying indirectly that accumulation of wealth is not touched and keeps running without being challenged. So I think one opportunity we have is that people become much more aware of the consequences of climate. And by discussing some of the opportunities for addressing the climate difficulties, such as how do we handle financing for climate, are going to push for reform and are going to demonstrate that, in fact, these things are interlinked and that we have attained a level of crisis that obliges us to look into inequality, not just as something that we should do by the way, as something that is central for us to be able to address the systemic issues of the world. Thank you.
Well, what a powerful discussion so far and wonderful insights, and so excited to hear from Mr. Valde Almeida. And we'd love to get your perspective on global issues related to inequity, as well as how this is having an impact on national security of countries, but in this instance, your experience with the UK and the European Union.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for the invitation. A couple of remarks. The first ones are rather personal. I was introduced as ambassador of the EU to the United Kingdom. I actually finished my job a couple of weeks ago, and I'm in transition to the academic world, which somehow explains my presence here, talking about inequality coming out of the United Kingdom. Or maybe not. That's for you to judge. But I'm also proud of being a founding participant of the Atlantic Dialogues when I was ambassador in Washington, and we started working with Moroccan friends, still in Rabat, so good to be here 10 years later. Two main points. The first one, to reflect a little bit the point of view from my part of the Atlantic. Europe, the United Kingdom, northwest or northeast, whatever you want to call it, Atlantic. First of all, I think we are very proud in the European Union that we were able to build a system which has the highest degrees of social protection in the world, the lowest degree of inequality in the world, and the highest, for some of our countries, levels of human development index. And I think, as Professor Carlos Lopes was saying, that we should be proud of the good things that we have done in the past, while being aware that a lot remains to be done. This being said, we still have immense dimension of inequality in the European Union, be it gender-based, be it revenue-based, be it regional-based, because we are not a totally homogeneous territory, as you well know. So the fight goes on. And I give you one figure, one target that we are focusing on these days. We would like to reduce by 15 million the poverty, the number of people in poverty, of which 5 million would be children, by 2030. And in doing so, we are implementing in our own space the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. But I would like to address the present situation in which we are, which was not that much covered by the previous panelist. We have today the combination of the structural global challenges that Carlos Lopes very eloquently addressed, with two factors, which are, from the last couple of years. And that is, of course, the pandemic, the worst pandemic in our lifetime, that affected all of us. And I'm talking about my part of the world. It affected immensely the European Union. It required a level of response absolutely unprecedented, quality and quantity-wise. But it's still there, and the impact is there. And the impact is on inequality, because it affected some people more than others. It affected some countries more than others. And fundamentally, it affected and impacted the role of the state. The state in Europe today, and I'm talking only about my region, but I know that is the case even more so in other parts of the world, is under enormous pressure. For reasons that were eloquently highlighted in a panel already in this session of Atlantic Dialogues by prestigious economists. Some of them are in the room, so I wouldn't dare go into the analysis of that. The question is enormous pressure. The worst job in Europe today is to be finance minister, right? Or prime minister. We are beginning a very tough winter in Europe because of this pressure. People request the state to intervene, request the state to spend money, the state spends money, the deficit grows, the debt grows, and inflation comes back, and I'm oversimplifying a very complex situation. But this is politically the problem we have today in Europe. The second factor, I'm sorry to come back to this, is the invasion of Ukraine, which has put enormous additional pressure on our economies, on our finances, on our fiscal situation, and this is one that we cannot simply ignore if one wants to describe the present situation and how it stimulates and contributes to growing inequalities. So my last point will be about the fact that for us, for me at least, inequality is not only a social issue. It should not be in the box of the social issues. And maybe it's not by chance that inequality comes only on the third day of the Atlantic Dialogues, but that's a mild criticism. But I think it reflects the fact that sometimes we try to put, in this kind of discussions, the social issues a little bit down the agenda. The fact being that, as was clearly stated by Carlos, inequality is in a way a strategic issue. In the sense that if we don't address it, there are different ways of doing so. I agree with some, I disagree with some of the ideas put on the table, but we need to discuss how to deal with it. If we don't do anything, if we ignore the strategic dimension of inequality, we are taking enormous risk. It affects the prosperity capability of countries. If we want to bring up people to higher levels of human development, it affects the stability of countries and regions. It is a security issue at the end of the day. So I would like to see the issue of inequality or excessive inequality. We will always have inequality, let's be clear and frank. The problem is the degree of inequality, the visibility of inequality, which is an element of globalization that we should not underestimate. It can ultimately become a security problem. Migration, instability, populism, authoritarian regimes can be the outcome of the deficit of addressing this problem. So it needs domestic action, it needs global action. I'm sure in the next rounds we can be able to address that. But I'm focused today particularly on what we can do on the short term, on the very short term, to address the most recent factors that impact upon inequality. And I mentioned them, and I'm sure we can come back to those. Thank you very much.
Thank you kindly. Well, we're going to go to a word cloud before proceeding with more questions. So I hope you'd open up your apps and take a moment to answer this question or comment, and that is use one word to describe the impact of inequality and inequity on the next generation. We see words like poverty, strife, injustice, vulnerability, debt, loss of hope, injustice we mentioned, despair, conflict. Professor, you talked about the next generation and brought in the climate challenges and can't underscore how important and impactful that is to think about in this conversation. I'm so curious as we think about the governance aspect of this conversation and how governments and social states are working to find balance for not just their citizens, but for other countries. How is taxing or taxes, how would that play a role in combating inequality? And what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a very important issue to try to increase the fiscal space of countries. It's very difficult to do it when you are facing headwinds like the ones that have been described. It's not the moment where countries will be able to actually accelerate some of the changes that are necessary to increase their tax collection. There's fiscal pressure. Fiscal pressure in general in Africa is very low. And that explains why countries have lots of difficulties, partly to pay and service their debt, partly to attend to social demands. You have an average of about 20% fiscal pressure in some countries, but the majority are way below. The average in Africa is 15. But a country like Nigeria, the largest economy in the continent, has a fiscal pressure of just 5%, which is quite ridiculous. And it shows that we have a structure in our economic management. Most African countries, obviously there are exceptions, that is based on rent-seeking behavior, where a lot of the commodities that are exported generate some resources that are used partly by the elites, partly to compensate for external obligations. But the rest of the population is sort of left as a third priority in the distribution. And how do we change that behavior? Well, we need to do things like structural transformation of the economies. What Minister Serigne Diop was mentioning is basically an attitude of being proactive in terms of reforms, to be able to actually compensate for a very long period of stagnation in terms of economic structures, and where we just reproduce the colonial model of commodity dependency. If you look into the statistics of African exports, 80% is still commodities, 40% fossil fuels. So there is no future in that. But that's what we have. And in order to change it, yes, you need a bit more of space. and taxes play a very important role. But this being said, I was quite impressed that during the pandemic, some countries actually introduced innovative social benefits to the population, and they took care with a certain degree of resilience to the problems that were generated by the pandemic without very little support from the outside. The support that normally is mentioned is that, you know, we have given this X amount of vaccines or ventilators or whatever, and aid has gone up slightly, you know, in terms of increase of ODA, official development assistance, probably less than 5%. But that is not really commensurate to the difficulties that were created by the pandemic. We know that some multilateral development institutions have attained record levels of disbursement to countries like in Africa. But what we normally don't mention in the same sentence is that most of the economies in Africa have increased their GDP quite significantly. So in percentage terms, all these amounts of concessional lending and ODA are way below the averages of the last few decades, because, you know, GDP has grown quite significantly. And to find in this very complicated space ways of actually introducing new social schemes is quite spectacular. So you have countries like Namibia, like Togo, like Côte d'Ivoire, and I think Senegal too, that have introduced digital platforms for disbursements of social protection benefits during the pandemic, with very little red tape, with, you know, use that is quite intensive of technology. So this is very promising, because I don't think a lot of these gains that were introduced during the pandemic are going to be reversed. They have now stayed there. People are used to them, and the state will have to basically respond to these new types of obligations. In countries like South Africa, where I live, there was an additional disbursement for people affected by the pandemic without a certain threshold of resources that are also quite close to a basic universal grant. And I think the debate is there, and it's very central right now in the policy discussions to try to create these new opportunities. So I think Africans have demonstrated a certain level of resilience. Within these characteristics I mentioned, there was very little room for maneuver. Tax collection has actually not gone down significantly during 20 and 21. In some countries it has gone up, like in South Africa, which is quite spectacular, but it's related to very specific reasons that I don't have the time to elaborate here. But I think the larger debate is still to be made, and the African case for a real reform of its tax structure, tax collection, tax policies is still outstanding.
Thank you. Ms. Fernandez de la Vega, how might Latin America and Africa, or countries within, work together to combat inequity, and particularly as it relates to how those inequities impact the citizens of those countries, those various countries and those spaces across the Atlantic? How can there be more cooperation?
Pues si me permite, me gustaría contarle mi última experiencia en relación a lo que me acaba de preguntar. África, América Latina, cómo están trabajando para poder seguir adelante. Y en una cumbre que hemos celebrado hace unas semanas, ¿no se oye?
It's on channel 2.
¿No se oye? ¿Se oye ahora? Sí, se oye, de acuerdo. Decía que, le decía a la moderadora que si me permitía contarle una experiencia que he vivido personalmente y que tiene que ver con una cumbre que hemos celebrado hace poco en España, dirigida por la fundación que tengo el honor de presidir, una fundación, Mujeres por África, que tiene como objetivo contribuir al desarrollo de África a través de las mujeres, y que hemos reunido en Madrid.
In Madrid, we're working with very women leaders on both continents, and these women spoke very clearly about how Latin American countries and African countries could work together and thereby improve the situation of women. And these women, I'm going to repeat what was said, because the problems that we are seeing in the world will not be corrected if we do not listen to the voice of all of the women throughout the world who are educated, who have capacity. And nobody's listening to them. Nobody spreads their thinking. Nobody circulates their ideas. The women at the summit, Latin American women and African women, many of them powerful political leaders, met during 2 days at this summit. They identified with each other. They talked about their mutual problems, and they sought solutions. They stretched the shores of the Atlantic basin. It was an extraordinary debate. Through these discussions, through the exchange of ideas and of the capacity that women have to be empathic with others, to put ourselves in others people's shoes, is very necessary. And not everybody has that possibility. I would like to thank all of the presidents here. For example, I'd like to commend the president of Senegal for the work that they're doing there, and they should count on our support. In Africa, you have extraordinary wealth. Women, they're prepared, they're educated, they're intelligent, they're powerful, they make proof of solidarity, and they're willing to do everything, to face everything. Use this capital, because not everybody has this capital. Africa has this capital. That is a very important topic. There was a connection between Latin American women and African women that was extraordinary. We're talking about bringing together continents. We're talking about how to exchange ideas. It would have been wonderful for you to have seen what went on at that summit, how the women exchanged ideas, how they enriched their own ideas, and how they came up with solutions for the future. The women came together, had discussions. They stretched the shores of the Atlantic through this debate, through women's capacity to be empathic. And we managed to move together forward towards equality. We spoke about equality, and we developed solutions to improve equality for women on both continents. And I assure you, we're going to move forward. We're going to do it. We're going to do it together, women together, and we're going to make it. We're going to get to the spheres of power, those spheres of powers that we have historically been excluded from. There are just these aren't just myths. These are just not whimsical objectives. We have quotas, percentages, but these are insufficient. We are not using part of our fundamental human capital that we need to develop, that we need for peace, that we need to move forward on all fronts. And here we have the example, an example of what can happen when African and Latin American women come together. And after this summit, they continued working, bringing together the shores of both continents, creative women, women who, from care networks to women's rights networks, are willing to come together to fight once against the patriarchy. And we have to put an end to it because we have to deal with everything that brings about poverty, that brings about COVID, because this kind of crisis brings about good things, but also brings about bad things. And the women have gotten together to say we have to put an end to the bad things. This is my positions. Well, we have to hear, adopt solutions. We have to focus on this human capital that you have available, Mr. President, that we need to promote. We have, for example, a network of super scientists, women, more than 100 of them, more than 100 scientists, women from Africa who work in the biggest and most powerful research centers. And everybody is looking for these women, and they come from Senegal, from Mali, from just about all of the countries of Africa. When I started the They Do Research, Women Do Research program, somebody asked me, are there researchers? Are there female researchers in Africa? Yes, there are, and they work in many areas that are minority areas where there are very few men because they're very difficult fields to work in. There are astrophysicists, for example. We have a network of more than 100 African women scientists. That's capital. That's impressive human capital. Presidents, I call on you to use this capital and to give them the space they need to move forward. We now have 120, but we could, in a very short amount of time, have 200, because there are a lot of young women in universities who can come in. We need to help them. We need to help them get educated, get trained, so that they can bring in modernity, so that they can contribute all of the things that we all need and that African countries need in particular. I'd like to make a call. I'd like to put out a call to all African leaders. I call on them to recognize this capital. If they don't know where this capital is, call me. I'll send you a list of many of them. We have many connections in Africa that can help you identify them. And if you can't find them, I'm going to put them at the doorstep of your presidential palaces so that you can use them, so that women can participate in the highest spheres of politics in your country. This will help your policies be more modern, more safe, and have greater power with respect to the rest of the world.
Women must be at the center of this conversation and a part of the solution. I'm going to go to Minister Diop, but I'm also going to ask the same question of the audience. So open your apps, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. As Minister Diop, I ask you this question. How can governments and communities work together to reverse inequities? I'm sure there's a way through crowdsourcing. You guys will also have some great ideas.
Yes, this is a very, very good question. First of all, I must congratulate my Teresa for this big talk about women. And I fully agree with you. Muy de acuerdo con usted. What I just want to share here is our experience in how to fight inequality and how community and government can work together. The first thing is, first of all, to measure it. You need really to measure, to map the poverty in the country. This is very important because, as I said, it's very different from coastal area to forest area to urban area to suburb area. It's very different. Secondly, you must develop programs that are just adapted to families. I will come back to some of the solutions we did in Senegal. You need also to have targets of maybe women. That's very important. In the case of Senegal, for instance, for what we call bourse familiale, grant to families, actually those grants were given directly to women. 500,000 families before COVID, and after COVID, we were doing direct transfer via numeric means to families. So that's very important to target correctly women, because when you give this money to women, you are sure that it will go to the family and it will use correctly. But it's not enough. You need to make sure that the youth, they get education. They get jobs as well in the future. They get vocational training. Actually, the key reason why we have this poverty in Africa is our system education is not adapted any longer. We had this system before where the only target was to go to university. Baccalaureate, university, maîtrise, master degrees. So you have so many master degrees today in Africa, but these master degrees, they do not correspond to what Africa needs. So most of the young people, when they go out of the university, they don't have a job because they have a master in law, a master in economics, or in some areas where while we need actually to have these young people in agriculture, in industry, in science and technology. So I think if you go to the root cause of the poverty, and the solution is really to reform the whole system of education. That's what we are doing today in Senegal. We are building 45 vocational training schools so that 30% of the young people could go to technical schools. Like in Switzerland, I spent all my, when I was in Nestlé in Switzerland, I spent more than 20 years. The German system and the Swiss system are very strong because any 20% will go to university. In Africa, 80% want to go to university. But not only they want to go to university, but they will go for the wrong training. So I think this is very important in terms of reform solutions. The other solution I see also is the reform at the level of the fiscality. You talked about it. Today, our system of collecting this tax is very poor. You talked about it. It's very difficult to have a real map of who must pay the tax, which company is in the agriculture, in the industry, in the trade. It's very difficult. And you cannot really distribute income that you don't have. So government must also do reform, must put in place a very, very good system to collect more income. Otherwise, we'll having this big gap between poor people and also rich people. What I saw also in inequality recently is during the COVID vaccine, the COVID period. You talked about it. During the COVID period, I myself went to Texas. The president asked me to go to Texas to find vaccine for the country. When I came to Texas, I met some companies, Johnson & Johnson, and I went also to Boston, my previous city. And then I was just said, okay, sorry, we cannot give you any vaccine because the government, American government, just need the vaccines. So from that, when we came back, we start thinking about how Senegal, Africa in general, must fight this inequality for access to vaccine for the future. And solution, we are building now the Madiba production of vaccine in Dakar for all Africa. We have decided that now, from now on, Africa will not depend on vaccine for rubeole, for COVID, for any other. And many young graduates came back to start working on these vaccines. So you see this inequality, you should not forget also access to health, la salud. this access to health is very, very important as well. So it means that today, the Atlantic Dialogue today is really a very, very important tool to start thinking about this global, the solution for this global inequality. But every nation, every government must start now bringing solution, identifying clearly what are the root cause of inequalities by asking the 5 whys, and what are the solution, and how do we measure now the impact. We will not solve it now. Even in 2030, we will not solve the equality. We will not solve it. But we know that if you have a very strong policy, if the income increase, this will you have a solution. And the other experience also I wanted to share is the petrol and the gas. As you probably know, Senegal has discovered huge quantity of petrol and gas. This will help us to be much more autonomous, to invest more in social, in infrastructure, and by the way, to reduce the inequality. This is really the strength of the government. But in addition to that, we have just decided that 15% of the petrol income and the gas income will be actually reserved to the next generation, to once again avoid this inequality between now and the next generation coming. So we need to protect the next generation by reserving a part of this important income in the future. So this also was a solution and we have also a bad experience on inequality in some African countries. In 1980, we had a civil war in the south of the country just because of inequality in Casamance, as you probably know, which ended now. Because many investments were just in the capital city, in what we call the east and the north part, and the south was just left without major investment. And this lead to frustration. So I fully agree with you that the consequence of inequality, the political consequence can be very, very serious. And our role as political people, as leaders, local leaders, ministers, but I would say all the community, whether it's economical community, financial community, university community, we must really prevent this from happening. And the only way is to take courageously, of course, our responsibility as leaders to take the decision. Of course, increasing of tax is not welcome by the bankers, by the financial community. They don't like it at all. But the government must find the right balance between tax increase and, of course, economy investment, because you should really make sure that you have both of the levels to be able to do the job. So really, in summarizing, education is critical to reduce really those inequality. This is my own experience. When I built the school in my college, in my community, I just saw 20 years later how you can impact families who start having now people highly educated and also contributing. So really, thank you very much for this important task. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to segue to questions, but as we do, I wanted to acknowledge you can either raise your hand or put your question in the app, but I wanted to acknowledge the word cloud that you also helped crowdsource the answer, and therefore ask Mr. Vélez de Almeida a question around one of the things that we saw up here was around building trust, locally led solutions, reform taxation, and fair collaboration. And when I saw some of those key words, I thought about the good graces of donors and people who are trying to solve problems and how their values will play a role in this solution. And so curious of your perspective on how governance and then independent donors or NGOs or other organizations, how their values will play a role in this conversation.
Thank you very much. I'm inspired by what I see on the screen to raise what I think is most of the time the elephant in the room, is the issue of governance. And there are two aspects that I would like to focus. One is about the governments and their responsibility to increase or reduce inequality. And the second one is the responsibility of donors to make sure that their guiding principles and concrete action do not contribute to inequality. And I think we have to be very, very humble in addressing this. How many governments in recipient countries have contributed to reduce inequality? And how many have contributed to increase inequality? And I think we should ask this very humble question if we want to progress. The other issue is to look at the donors and see which donors have contributed to raise inequality and how many have contributed to reduce inequality. And this is about the principles and the action and the values behind development cooperation. It would not surprise you that I say that I believe that the European Union is very committed to respecting principles in its development cooperation that do not contribute to inequality, that do not contribute to climate change, that do not contribute to accentuate the main problems we've been discussing here. And if I look at our priorities today, it's first of all about SDGs. And I'm astonished to see, having been ambassador to the UN for 4 years, how little SDGs are mentioned in a conference like this one for 3 days. And how far, and I'm very worried by it, and I'm sure Professor Carlos Lopez is as well, how far SDG and the 2030 agenda is from the agenda of debate, the debating agenda, the circles where people, responsible people debate. We need to re-energize that situation. We try to stick to it. We try to remain loyal to this agenda. So today, our focus is on social inclusion, on anti-poverty, on food insecurity, on decent jobs, and on education particularly. And I join Mrs. Fernandez de la Vega, particularly for women and girls in the developing world. I'm not sure all the donors have the same focus. People may diverge, but I have reasons to believe that this is not entirely shared. The second point I'm inspired to raise, looking at the screen, is the issue of globalization. We had a period of, 20 years or so of hyper-globalization, which has produced, as Carlos mentioned, enormous benefits for mankind. I think it's not exaggerated to say that mankind progressed more in 20 years than in a number of centuries in terms of spreading prosperity, if you want. But of course, globalization, particularly if it is a hyper one, must have downsides. And it had downsides. And today the debate is about deglobalization, reglobalization, friendly shoring, reshoring, strategic autonomy, you name it. My point is, let's avoid throwing the baby with the bathwater. We have a problem with the bathwater, but I think we should focus on the baby. And the baby is to find domestic, national, but also regional, and maybe local, global as well, solutions for the downsides of globalization. You know, the problem being that globalization created many jobs, but destroyed many jobs. The problem is that technologies create new jobs, but not necessarily where they destroyed the old jobs. And this is the role for governance, for governments in our countries, in your countries, to address these issues. The solution is not to kill globalization. Globalization would be, you know, shrinking the markets, closing the markets, would not be to the benefit of those who still need to reap the benefits of global trade and open economies.
Thank you kindly. We have time for a few questions, and these are the ground rules. You have 20 seconds to ask your question. No statements, only a question, and individual panelists up to 1 minute. So you will be asking a question of one panelist. We will not be able to have time for the full panel to respond. We have 6+ minutes, so we're going to move through this quickly. We have a hand down here.
Thank you very much. One question. Very much inspired by your presentation, but the question here, you said you were stressing on capital C for culture, capital E for education, which means one type of culture to dominate the entire diverse 8 billion people. Doesn't this really backfire to the very title, which is addressing inequalities. I'm absolutely worried about that. And systemic inequality, very quickly, systemic inequality, that is, UN 5 member countries decide for particularly Africa, there's no voice for it. So it keeps on recurring and repeating itself. How can you really maintain equality?
And who is the question addressed to? And who is your question addressed to?
One, and second, finally.
One, thank you.
Sí, sí. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I think that there's still a lot of work to do. A lot to do in order to ensure the benefit of equality for everyone. And since we are seeing that the governance factors are oftentimes very weak. They are weak. They're fragile. They're not strong enough. They're not committed enough. And I think we should adopt policies that are strong, committed, and clear. It is necessary to make progress in institutional innovation processes by creating international structures, not only at national level, but also at the international level. These are so outdated. They're really, really outdated. They're really old. And these new structures, with only by the representation power given by the people, will be able to govern. And this is absolutely paramount from a democratic point of view. Without democracy, there is no progress. And without progress, there is no well-being. And without well-being, we will have an utter disaster. That's the truth. And we are still witnessing a situation that I wouldn't dare say is disastrous, but is inefficient and insufficient. And then again, we need women. Either you are convinced and clear on that, or we will not make any progress whatsoever. Women must come at the forefront, at the political forefront, at the scientific forefront, also in medicine. They need to be there, and we need to support them. We need to take them out of where they are now and put them in their right place. And I can assure you, I had experience working with Latin American and African women, and I was absolutely gobsmacked, if I may say.
Of a hand right here, quickly.
Hello, and thank you very much for a wonderful panel. I'm Landry Signé, Senior Fellow here at the Policy Center for the New South and at the Brookings Institution. So my question is to Minister Diop. So the welfare state, we know, are extremely important and require specific resources, as highlighted by Professor Lopez. In the context of African countries, numerous of them, or many of the fragile countries which are not able to deliver basic public services and goods, are based in Africa. And you mentioned the preference of Africa for welfare states. So isn't it contradictory to the fragility on one hand, but also on the other hand, a model which requires resources and which requires a state with strong capacity? Thank you.
1 minute.
Yes, I think the most important is the heterogeneity of Africa. You know, when we talk about Africa, we have tendency to believe that we are all the same. Nigeria is the same, and Burkina Faso, and Senegal. And so. You're right. It looks like there's a contradiction between the fact that in the city centers, people we would come to find wealth, will find a job, will find education, and at the same time, in the other areas, people would just face starvation, poverty, and so on. But my solution is to start measuring and mapping. As soon as you start measuring and mapping the degree of poverty, from one continent, from one country, from one region to another, then you can start finding solutions. Secondly, I believe that we have the African Union that can also bring a lot of solutions, global solution. Now we have 54 countries, and the African Union should not now wait only for the rest of the world to start addressing poverty. The other is in West Africa, we have this ECOWAS as well, that is trying to find also a solution. And in the 15 countries where we have a lot of program now for fighting this poverty. So this is really, I think, very, very critical. And I think we need to push more to have like common policies like the European Union is doing to face the different poverty at youth level, at women level, at between cities and villages and so on. I think in the next coming years, yeah, we can have a reduction of the gap between these very, very high-end people, because we have them, and the low-end classes as well.
Thank you kindly. We actually ended exactly on time, to the second. So with that, we'll have to end the conversation for today. I know it's so hard because there's so much more dialogue that we could have on this topic, but we'll be able to talk throughout the rest of the conference. And I wanted to thank all of our esteemed panelists and the staff and the folks who have put on the Atlantic Dialogues. We're grateful to be a part of this wonderful conference. And you are asked to remain seated. The next panel will start immediately, so please remain in your seats, and thank you for your time. Let's take a quick picture of us.